Restart the recording.
And Mark can restart the recording. Thanks again.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me. I'm glad that I have the opportunity to talk about this interesting topic, and so I'll get right to it. So I'll be talking about the transition to the production of electric vehicles in the East Central European integrated periphery. Okay, here it goes. So the main argument of my talk, go back, trying to navigate. All right, is that in order to understand what is happening, in order to understand this transition, we need to really set this process of change in the East European or East Central European automotive industry in the context of the changes in Europe and the European automotive industry as a whole. And my argument is that the course of the transition in East Central Europe is very much affected by its relative position in global value chains, global production networks, and in the international division of labor of the automotive industry as the integrated periphery in Europe and its automotive industry. So that's one main argument. And the second one is, of course, that this transition to the production of electric vehicles is very uneven across East Central Europe, and both spatially, and it is also uneven in terms of its impacts across the automotive industry. So let me start with this idea of the spatial concept of integrated periphery, which I have tried to develop as a kind of a more general concept of one area spatially in which, or one type of macro region where in the past 30 years, there has been a very rapid development of the automotive industry. I have kind of thought of this, of course, using the example of Europe and, of course, East Central Europe in particular, but the general features of the integrated periphery have, I would argue, more general validity. And for example, in the case of the North American automotive production networks and macro-regional production network, it works very well as well, with Mexico being a good example of an integrated periphery. So these are, as I have mentioned, regions that have experienced rapid growth in the automotive industry in the past several decades. So as such, these are dynamic regions of growth and development. And it is important to, one more thing that I want to add before I get into this, this idea of integrated periphery also kind of works historically because, as we will see, there have been other integrated peripheries that I would call old integrated peripheries that were integrated into the European automotive industry before East Central Europe. So, for example, Spain and Portugal in the 1980s, and in the 60s, it started, for example, with Belgium, right? And so it's a more general concept. So these are the areas that have seen rapid development of the automotive industry. And they have several features that kind of distinguish them and that made this rapid development possible. The first one is that they typically have lower wages than we can see in traditional regions. of core regions of the automotive industry. At the beginning of the development, these lower wages were also combined with a sizable labor surplus, which, however, over time gets exhausted as the auto industry basically exploits this labor surplus. They are typically located close to large and lucrative markets, which is important because it lowers transportation costs. These areas need to be part of some regional trade agreements or preferential trading arrangements that basically allow for tariff-free trade and movements of goods, components, and so on. There are also typified very high degree of foreign ownership and control, as we will see. Production is typically highly export-oriented. So in many cases, more than 90%, in some cases 98, 99% of cars that are being produced are exported. Typically, these are either standardized cars or niche market vehicles, and typically also kind of standard automotive components, generic automotive components. These regions also experienced or have very limited development of high value added and strategic functions. Typically, we would talk about research and development functions, but there are other like decision-making functions about investments and so on. These types of functions, of course, tend to be concentrated in the home countries of foreign investors. The states in these countries pursue FDI-friendly policies, compete among themselves over the investment, which very often leads to the so-called race to the bottom. Another important feature is weak labor unions and more liberal labor codes compared to the core or traditional areas of the automotive industry. The domestic auto industry is typically underdeveloped, and if domestic firms are basically integrated in the foreign control auto industry at all, they are usually integrated in subordinate positions as tier 3 suppliers, sometimes tier 2, but generally domestic firms are quite weak and unable to globalize. Although this might change over time, as we have seen in the cases of, for example, some Spanish domestic firms that over decades they've been able to grow and globalize as well, right? So these areas are typically integrated into these macro-regional production networks of the auto industry as what we call assembly platforms and in the dependent position. So these general points basically can be supported by the empirical evidence. So for example, and let me try. So for example, I have calculated the index of foreign control for all European countries for which data is available. And as you can see, the latest available data for 2019, but you can see that countries of East Central Europe has by far the highest index of foreign control. In the case of Slovakia, it's 98%. Basically, these countries are either above 90% or just close to 90%. Now, compare that with Germany, which is, of course, the core area or higher order core area of the automotive industry in Europe, and its index of foreign control, it's 15% or 15. So it's much lower than the case of East Central Europe, suggesting, of course, that the automotive industry of East Central Europe is basically controlled from abroad. And of course, since the early 1990s, there was a lot of investment, FDI, in the automotive industry of East Central Europe. You can see that it peaked in 2019 with the FDI stocks at about 45 billion euros. It slightly decreased the latest data for 2021 at 42 billion. That's, I think, because of the COVID crisis and basically foreign companies sometimes withdrawing some of the assets to deal with the problems, economic problems. Of course, the foreign direct investment stocks are unevenly distributed in East Central Europe. And we can clearly see that basically most of that investment is concentrated in what we call Central Europe, basically Poland, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, plus Romania in Southeastern Europe. That's where the largest capital has been invested. That's where the largest number of foreign control enterprises in the auto industry is located. And that's also where the largest number of workers are working in these foreign controlled enterprises. So, of course, we could discuss why this is the case. There's a number of factors, but geographic proximity to the core of the European automotive industry is obviously an important factor, which is combined with lower production costs and also availability of labor force or labor surplus at the early stages of this development of the auto industry in the 1990s. If you look at the regional production trends in Europe between 1991 and 2022, I have basically looked at how the integrated periphery in terms of the overall output performed compared to other macro regions, well, basically Germany and the rest of Western Europe. I need to know that the integrated periphery on this chart does not only include East Central Europe, but also includes the older integrated periphery, Spain and Portugal, and Turkey, which is not shown on the map, but is clearly integrated into the European automotive industry, and Morocco, right? So it's kind of a broader definition of the integrated periphery. But you can see that the output increased from about 3 million units in 1991 to about 7 million in 2022, so it more than doubled. At the same time, we can see that what I call the rest of the West European automotive industry, which means it's Western Europe minus Germany, Spain, and Portugal here. So principally it would include France, Italy, Britain, Sweden, right? We can see that its car production peaked around 2000, and since then it has been steadily declining, right? So it was 7.5 million, and now it's down to about 3 million. Germany was able to kind of keep up the production volumes up until about 2015. Since then, it has been declining. Of course, 2020, 2022, these declines, of course, are the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. There has been kind of slight recovery, especially in the case of the integrated periphery. I have also plotted here Russia and Ukraine just out of curiosity, because it's, you know, their auto industry is not integrated in the European automotive industry production system. And we can see that it has been hovering around 1 million units. And then we can see the effect of the war in Ukraine, and more importantly, the withdrawal of Western companies out of Russia and the subsequent collapse of the automotive industry output in 2022. What is also interesting here on the right is how these kind of regions within Europe or within macro-regional European-based production system, because we are including Morocco and Turkey, how their share in, of the total car output has changed during those 30 years. And we can see that the share of the integrated periphery increased from 18% in 91 to 50% by 2022 of the total car output, while the share of Germany decreased from 30 to 25%. Perhaps most importantly, the share of the rest of Western Europe basically halved from 44 to 22%. And the share of Russia and Ukraine has always been low, but by 2022, it went down to only 3%. Of course, this is the outcome of the restructuring of the automotive industry in Europe. So it's not so much, at least so far, it has not been really the kind of outcome of some kind of decline overall of the European automotive industry. But it's been the process of geographical restructuring and geographic shifts in production, which is nicely shown basically by this chart. I have done some analysis of job creation and job loss by medium-sized and large automotive industry firms in the European Union and Norway at the firm level between 2005 and 2016. And basically, the outcome was very interesting in that sense that in terms of the overall number of jobs, job creation and job loss, Europe during that time lost 16,382 jobs. But 460,000 jobs were created and 79,000 jobs were lost, suggesting very dynamic processes taking place basically within European automotive industry. And of course, as you would probably expect, Western Europe had greater job loss than greater job production of job creation, while Eastern Europe had greater job creation than the job loss. And this map on the left basically shows that very nicely. Countries in the green color, which are part of the East European integrated periphery, perhaps here with the exception of Austria that had a slight net positive change, but we can see that Eastern European countries generally had net gains in terms of jobs, while the rest of Western Europe or the rest of Europe basically had job net losses in terms of jobs. So there has been an ongoing restructuring, geographic restructuring, right? Eastern Europe growing, as all of you know, Western Europe basically stagnating or losing output. Now, I have mentioned that one of the important features of the integrated periphery is that there has been, of course, pretty much, very much emphasis on increasing production, but at the same time, other functions that are part of the automotive value chain, and especially high value added activities have been weakly developed. And one example of those activities is research and development. And so since we can get some data about research and development, we can actually compare countries. So I have calculated the index of what I call the index of innovation in the auto industry for 2017. And again, you can clearly see very nice division between Eastern Europe or East Central Europe and then the rest of Europe, with East European countries having much lower index of innovation than basically traditional core and also semi-peripheral areas of the European automotive industry. And of course, again, even within East Central Europe, there are important differences between countries, right? So generally, Central Europe is doing better than kind of Southeastern Europe in terms of research and development expenditures and research and development employment in the automotive industry. Also, we can also see here that while East Central Europe's share of the production and the output of cars, all vehicles, jobs has been around 1/4 and 1/3. The high share of jobs basically suggests that more labor-intensive activities were developed in East Central Europe. If you look at the share of R&D jobs and business R&D expenditures, we can see that these are much, much lower. So in other words, East Central Europe saw the growth in output and especially in the lower value added type of activities, while higher value added type of activities remained predominantly concentrated in Western Europe. And within East Central Europe, there's been a great concentration in Central Europe, which means Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Slovenia. And they account, these countries, for about 4/5 of East Central European or East Central European total. Okay, so this is the context, right? So I think it's important to understand this in order to understand what is happening in terms of the transition to the production of electric vehicles and what to expect, right? So all of you know that the transition has been driven by some political decisions. The European Commission setting by emission limits. Of course, we are not going to discuss this. And the second important driving force, of course, are car producers that are forced to basically accommodate or adapt their production in order to reach those or meet those emission limits. So it's actually these transnational corporations that are the driving force of the transition to the production of electric vehicles in East Central Europe. We already know that the auto industry is almost completely controlled by foreign capital in East Central Europe. So obviously, it will be foreign capital that will be also driving the transition towards the production of electric vehicles. What is the role of the states in this entire process? I think the role of the state of East Central European states has been limited, overall weak, and very much kind of confined to the attempts to influence the investment decisions of transnational corporations through providing investment incentives and through basically engaging in the interstate competition among themselves. And basically, it continues the previous trend, which has been, the race to the bottom. So what is the nature of this transition to electric vehicles in East Central Europe, and how does it compare to Western Europe? Generally, I would argue that East Central Europe has so far been experiencing a significantly slower transition to the production of electric cars than Western European, and especially core areas of Western European automotive industry. The evidence of that is that so far there are no electric vehicle dedicated factories for the mass production that have been basically operating in East Central Europe, although 2 factories are under construction, one by BMW in Hungary and one by Volvo in Slovakia. And at the end of the last year, there was an announcement by the Chinese BID about the construction another factory in Hungary. What is interesting, of course, that 2 of these 3 factories are basically Chinese controlled in the case of Volvo, or basically Chinese company in the case of BID. So, so far in the absence of these electric vehicle dedicated factories, the factories, foreign-owned factories of the automotive assembly firms have been pursuing the strategy of mixed production, which basically means that, in the existing assembly factories, the production of electric vehicles is basically started. Now, it's been argued that it is a less efficient strategy. It's, of course, because it's much more difficult to achieve scale economies. And these factories have been compensating with lower cost of labor, maybe some other lower costs, but over time, this strategy might prove to be kind of a long-term disadvantage unless East European factories are retooled and become more specialized in the production and the mass production of electric vehicles. So the production has been limited of electric vehicles in Eastern Europe so far. And also the kind of infrastructure necessary for this production has been more slowly developing, especially in terms of the development of battery gigafactories, which saw faster development in Western Europe. We'll have Márton will have the presentation about Hungary, and I'll mention that as well a little bit. So Western Europe has been basically faster in this, and there's been a huge investment in Western Europe. So, of course, we might think of this as some kind of reversal of the trend between 1990 and 2000 in terms of investment and location trends in the European automotive industry, but we will see whether this trend will basically also last. So if you look at the location of these battery gigafactories, all of you know, and Márton will talk about it, its development has been very uneven, and most of these investments either already realized or planned are taking place in Hungary. So Hungary has so far secured very high share, and I'm sure that Márton will talk about that, why that is the case. If you look at this table, you can see, maybe you can notice an absence of any gigafactory being built in Czechia, despite Czechia having the highest production of cars in East Central Europe. So it's an interesting point, and we might think or speculate about why this is the case, why Hungary and why nothing is happening in Czechia. Maybe we can talk about this during the discussion, and I can give you some explanation of that. Now, all of this means that production of cars with internal combustion engines will continue longer in East Central Europe than in Western Europe. So the slower pace of transition to the production of electric cars, longer production of cars with internal combustion engines. And there are several reasons for that. Of course, new assembly plants were built in East Central Europe in the past 30 years. So they are more modern, maybe more efficient factories. So it makes sense to basically build on this advantage and continue the production in more efficient factories than maybe in less efficient older factories in Western Europe that would be then kind of retooled or rebuilt to produce electric vehicles. Also, of course, we all know that according to the product life cycle model, older technologies continue longer in peripheral locations. So it makes sense that older technology based on internal combustion engines will continue longer in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. Eastern Europe has been targeted by some transfers of production of cars with internal combustion engines from Western Europe. The Volkswagen Passat is often cited example of that. Its production has been transferred from Germany to Slovakia to Bratislava assembly plant. Stellantis has increased the production of internal combustion engines in its factory in Hungary by 50%. And there are additional reasons for this longer production of cars with internal combustion engines in Eastern and Central Europe, lower production costs, which mean basically mainly lower wages, which again make this kind of older technology, at least according to the product life cycle, allows it to survive in these peripheral locations that have lower wages. Some factories in East Central Europe plan to continue production of these cars with internal combustion engines for non-European markets after 2035, 36. For example, Skoda is planning to produce its internal combustion engine cars for markets in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, India, for example. And another factor is that there's a lower demand for electric cars in East Central Europe because of very high costs and sometimes low kind of incentives or subsidies by the governments. So because of that, it makes sense to produce cars where they will be sold, right, with internal combustion engines. But as I already mentioned, it is a risky strategy because it might undermine long-term competitive position of East Central Europe and its automotive industry in the European auto industry as a whole. Now, so the transition has been slow so far. There's not much information and data available about, for example, the supply sector. I've been trying to launch research on the Czech supplier industry. I've been able to find some data about the suppliers in Slovakia. This is from 2019, but even at that time, when the transition was already underway in Western Europe, you can see that 38% suppliers supplied nothing for the production of electric vehicles and hybrid cars, and basically 4/5 supplied nothing or less than 5%. Of course, it has changed, but it suggests this slow pace of transition. The question is how this transition will affect employment. And of course, there's a lot of speculation about that. What seems to be the case is that these employment effects will be uneven, so different countries will most likely experience quite different effects. Klepa did analysis in 2021, which included Czechia, Poland, and Romania, and they basically projected powertrain employment between 2020 and 2040. And you can see significant differences. Czechia was projected to gain 100 jobs. Poland was projected to lose 11,000 jobs, and Romania 27,500 jobs. So significant differences. Now, I have also looked, and we don't have time to discuss this very briefly, into FDI, into the battery industry, so beyond battery gigafactories in Eastern Europe. And you can see that the two countries stand out, and it's again Hungary, which is in orange, and Poland, right? So these are basically suppliers of materials for the production of batteries. Now, if we compare that with the rest of East Central Europe, There is not much of it compared to Hungary and Poland. There's some assembly of batteries for the local productions, such as Skoda or Hyundai in Czechia, or Stellantis in Slovakia, but not much beyond that. This one, the last one, it was announced. It was supposed to be online, this Anadox Energy, in 2022, but I've been unable to find any information about this factory being actually built and coming online. So, slower transition, greater reliance on the continuing production of cars with internal combustion engines, which might be a long-term disadvantage. However, I think that in the long run, the comparative location advantages of East Central Europe will play an important role, right? So we'll still have lower wages than in Western Europe. The region is still located close to Western Europe. It's part of the EU, so these are definite locational advantages that will support the future development of the industry based on the electric engine technology. But there are some disadvantages. The biggest one has been related to labor shortages. These have been reported from all over the region of East Central Europe. Basically, a lot of investment in the past 30 years exhausted labor supply, which of course then leads to increased wages, which undermines the growth of the industry, right? And of course, in the past 2 years, the political risks have increased because of the war in Ukraine. So, in countries maybe such as Hungary or Slovakia or even Poland, some foreign investors might think, about some geopolitical risks. But overall, I would think that the drive for profit will prevail in the long run, right? So these lower cost locations in East Central Europe will continue to be attractive for foreign investors. I expect that the auto industry will continue to be strongly dominated by foreign capital and dependent on foreign capital and foreign technology. So it will definitely not lessen. It might increase the degree of foreign control. It's obvious also that East Central Europe will not and is not and will not be a center of innovation for electromobility. So we'll have continuing technological dependence in addition to capital dependence, right? So overall, basically, what it means is that this highly dependent peripheral position of East Central Europe in the European automotive industry will not change, right? And given the existing risks that are significant, I haven't talked about the increasing energy prices, for example. I think the best outcome for the automotive industry in East Central Europe is that basically these countries can hope that they will maintain their current integrated peripheral position. But in some countries, the future of the automotive industry is less certain. Obviously, there are differences between countries such as Hungary and Poland. On one side, they've been able to attract significant investment in the battery industry, and countries such as Czechia and maybe to a lesser extent Slovakia, they've been unable to do so. Okay, I am done. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry for taking slightly a little bit more time than was allocated to me. I was told beforehand that it would be 30 minutes.
No, it's okay. Perfect. Thank you very much. Very interesting, extremely interesting. And I believe the next presentation will be very complementary. We'll complete this. So you can share your slides. Perfect. I can see it.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for having me, and I think that was a really good talk by Petr to introduce the story. so I don't have to talk that much about the context. So my focus in this presentation will be to focus on Hungary and focus more on the battery industry, which is one part of this electric vehicle transition. And I won't talk that much about the supply relations in the electric vehicle manufacturing, for example. And my focus will also be more on the labor side. Petr already mentioned that there are some risks concerning that, particularly with the labor shortage, but I will explain more about that. I move to my next slide. I hope it moved as well in your screen. So the outline will be to give you some information about the battery manufacturing in the Hungarian context, and to talk a bit more about the current low road work model, which will most possibly come in the future for Hungary and maybe also for other countries in the region. And my key statement will be that this EV battery industry and the EV transition on a larger scale will solidify a low road work model in Hungary certainly in a new form somewhat, but some characteristics will be the same as in the previous boom of the economy there. So that's my kind of an introduction from the political side of the story. This is one Facebook post by our Prime Minister from this week, where he posted that we are producing electric cars in the Western world. Many car factories are closed or relocated. First time in history, we are not the followers of a technological revolution, but global spearheads, thereby saving our car factories as well. So this is like the very simplistic kind of political agenda of the Hungarian government, and also kind of a simplistic political explanation what will happen. But certainly Hungary is experiencing a large change with the transition of the electric vehicles. To give you more about the context a bit, Petr already showed some data on that, but Hungary is one of the largest battery manufacturer for electric vehicles in Europe. Will be, I think, the second largest according to estimates in 2030. The estimated gigafactory capacity will be 215 gigawatt hours per year, or even more by the mid of the decade. And the whole value chain is present in Hungary, except the minerals and their processing. So we don't have lithium reserves, and their processing is also not taking place in Hungary, but the rest is here. And the battery value chain is dominated by companies with East Asian headquarters, which is also a novelty if we compare that to the previous boom in the automotive sector after the 2008 crisis. The experts estimate that there will be more than 30,000 workers in the battery value chain by the middle of the century. And OEMs are also started to transition to EV assembly. That's very mixed. So some factories are having more assembly lines on that, others are not. And on the right side, you see the largest employers in the battery value chain. Of course, the largest employers will be the cell manufacturing companies, but other suppliers will also have like quite a large, I would say, factories with a few hundred, even 1,000 workers in the future. If we compare that and if we put together from the company announcements, of course, this is the estimate. It can be that that it changes in the meantime. If we look at the geographies of the battery value chain, we also have to highlight, I think, and this is also in line with what Petr already mentioned, that the geography is very uneven if we compare in the region. But even so, if we look at certain countries, that there might be also kind of very different in that sense. So this map shows the companies of the battery value chain. Some of them are already here and already operational. Others are just the future, and the construction of the factory started. But I argue that there are 4 regions with 4 quite different labor markets regionally. So one is the re-industrialized Northwest Hungary, which is already very re-industrialized during the past decades, after the change in 1990, with some car factories already present like for 30 years, such as Audi in Győr. And some of the battery manufacturing companies moved there. It is not that much logical because already there is a huge labor shortage in the region, but they want to expand a bit in this clustering of the value chain there. The second focus area is around the capital city of Budapest. Of course, as in other metropolitan areas, this is a very diverse labor market with a lot of service sector jobs. And what the companies might think is that, you know, there are many people who are workers there, so they might, you know, still find workers in the region who can commute from shorter distances and change for the battery manufacturing jobs. The third area in the east part of the country is the cluster around BMW and some of their suppliers. So BMW will start an electric vehicle factory in 2025. And several battery assembly factories moved into the same city, which has actually no manufacturing or automotive manufacturing history. And some suppliers of the battery value chain also are moving there. And the new thing is the BYD car factory in the southern part of the Hungary. This also doesn't have any car assembly or automotive value chain history that much. Some tier 1, tier 2 suppliers are there in the region, but this will be a huge investment and a huge change for the life of the city in terms of industrial structure. So that's sort of an overview of what is happening currently. I will move to the second part, which explains somewhat how this low road growth model is taking place in Hungary. So the previous literature said that Central and Eastern Europe moved towards a high road growth model in automotive manufacturing in the 2000s. So there were some hints to that, and there were some examples of moving up in the value chain for higher added value kind of activities in these companies. Whereas in the second part of the 2010s, so before the COVID crisis, Hungary was also featured by a lock-in kind of effect in these low wage, low value added parts of the automotive value chain. So in the second half of the 2010s, so the previous decade, there was a growth of automotive jobs in Hungary, but with these really low wage, low value added parts, which were partly relocated from the core countries of the European Union. What we see with the EV transition is that the production system changes, and there are arguments that the mass production of electric vehicles will be moving into the low wage kind of production model, which will also affect battery manufacturing in Hungary and elsewhere, and also the assembly of electric vehicles. For example, Petr mentioned the powertrain story. There also the putting together a electric powertrain. For that, you don't need that much workers, and they don't need to be skilled in that extent than in the internal combustion engine powertrain. So that, if you put together these stories, there are arguments that what we will see in the upcoming years is an automotive downgrading in Hungary, because of the expanding battery manufacturing with low wage jobs. So I would argue that that there will be this low road model coming up in the next years, and also the dependencies from OEMs will change a bit. And I think that's my next slide. So that's like the kind of summary of what is happening with this dependence of the automotive sector in Hungary, and also that can be generalized into this story of East Central Europe. So what we have seen previously, that Western European OEMs, particularly German OEMs, were building OEM production sites in the region, also in Hungary. And with the transition with electric vehicles, East Asian battery firms, these can be either cell assembly plants or their suppliers, they are having production sites moving into Hungary, which will then supply these OEMs either in the Hungarian location, or some of the materials, components, cells will be exported within the European Union. So these are very much for the European Union market. And Hungary was kind of a key, also together with Poland, to concentrate the large chunk of the battery value chain into the country. So there is this dual dependence, one by the decisions made in German OEMs in Germany, and how they reallocate the production of electric vehicles within Europe. So that's one part of the dependence, and the other part is which is coming and which is happening also, is the dependence on decisions made in the headquarters of the battery firms. So how they decide which part of the production remains in China, or which part moves to Germany or Hungary or to other locations. So that will be sort of a dual dependence. With the coming of the BYD car factory in Szeged, that might change, because there will be a new OEM which has a headquarter in East Asia. So that might change in the future. So that's shortly how the supply relations and how these dependencies are organized currently, if you take into account these global embeddedness into value chains of the countries. Let me then move quickly to some characteristics of this low road growth model. And I will argue that there are three factors I would like to go through in the upcoming minutes. So one characteristic is how the global economic cycle makes this story happening in Hungary. The second part is the transformation of the production regime. And the third one is the labor. I will talk a bit more about that aspect as well. So the first aspect is the global economic cycle. Petr already mentioned, and this is also a crucial issue in Hungary, that there is a labor shortage in the second half of the 2010s. And although the industry relocation to the European integrated periphery was a key driver, that there is this labor force, it exhausted, and it is also partly because of the free movement of the people within the European Union. And to make it to put that more into the context, for example, the Prime Minister Orbán said last year that there are additional 500,000 workers needed in the Hungarian labor market in the next years, in a country of 4.7 million employees. So that might be a bit over exaggerated, but still the problem is there, that the country needs workers, and it might not be a temporary issue with the transition and the job loss and job gain, which Petr showed beforehand in his presentation. So there is this global economic cycle with this labor shortage and this reallocation of or a new division of labor within Europe, but also the Eastern European context of the demographic decline will not make the story easier. So, for example, in Hungary, each year there are approximately 30,000 workers less because of the demographic decline. So that's also kind of makes the story more problematic. The second issue is the production regime, which is named in the literature with this word Foxconnization, which means that both in battery manufacturing and and also in the production of electric vehicles, there is this transition towards a model which resembles very much the electronics industry production model, which means that also partly the labor force, but also how the assembly lines are put together and how the production is organized. And there are certain characteristics of this Foxconnization which happens. So one is the de-skilling aspect, which means that there is a higher share of low-wage, unskilled jobs on highly automatized assembly lines, which leads to a higher turnover rates among workers. And what we see also in the Hungarian context that, for example, vocational school curricula were not really much changed to reflect of these changes that, you know, we will need people with a different skill set for assembling either electric cars or battery cells. What we also know from the literature is that 80 to 90% of are blue-collar workers in the cell production, which also means that there is a smaller need or a decreasing need for skilled workers in the assembly line, and these workers who are unskilled can be substituted with other workers to a higher extent. And there are no labor policy measures currently in Hungary to increase the employability of low-skilled people, which is also part of this kind of production regime, how it is put together. And that means also in the long run, I would argue, to a disruption of the skilled automotive industry worker identities, and also particularly or partly a disappearance of this blue-collar core worker group, unionized with stable jobs, which might be kind of detrimental for this transition in Hungary, but also elsewhere, I think, in other regions. That leads to also, and the part of the story is also with this Foxconnization, is that the power relations in the supply chains are moving towards the battery cell manufacturers, who will be the powerful actors, instead of the OEMs, which with the internal combustion engines were kind of a drivers of the whole supply chain, and they were the powerful actors. So that changes quite a bit. So that also means, for example, that union strategies will need to change or are changing a bit. So, for example, in Hungary, the union strategies was that, for example, a car assembly plants union in Hungary allied with IG Metall's union in Germany, you know, to bring better change for workers, but that won't work in the future because the decisions are not necessarily driven by the German OEMs, but the East Asian battery manufacturers will be kind of in a stronger position, at least until the European battery manufacturing not ramping up with the European players. So that is also kind of a part of the story. And what is to be seen in relation with this production regime, I think, is with what happens with the EU battery regulation, whether the corporate sustainability due diligence directive will be put into effect at the European level, despite the current setbacks in the past weeks, or the German supply chain law. So how these kind of regulatory changes will shape the production regime and shape the supplier networks in the country, and what effects will it have? It will have in value chains within the European Union. So that's kind of a sort of a question mark from me. On that slide, just to bring it more into concrete, I show the supply relation or supply links between the battery manufacturers already in Hungary or factories in construction and the OEMs all over Europe. So on the top part of the figure, you see the battery manufacturing locations. So Samsung SDI already is in operation for a few years. The South Korean SK owns two factories in 2 locations are already operational, and 3 others will come in the next year. So CATL, EV Power, and Sunwoda, all East Asian companies. And they already have some supply agreements with electric vehicle manufacturers. Some of them are already in Hungary, for example, Mercedes-Benz, which started to transition to EVs and hybrids. Volkswagen Group with Audi's large factory that started transitioning into electric powertrains, and hybrid models, but I think not yet into EVs. BYD already has a bus assembly plant in Hungary, but an EV factory was announced last year. BMW's EV factory, assembly factories, is in construction, and production will start next year. And there are also other factories like Stellantis, Ford, and Jaguar Land Rover, which are supplied from cell producers in Hungary. And then the batteries are transported into other countries of the European Union. What is typical in that setting in the Hungarian case, that these are multi-year agreements between those companies. So there, in Hungary, we don't have joint ventures, for example, which is like the model of the North American story, where car manufacturers and battery cell manufacturers established joint ventures. And what will also modify these supply links is that cell manufacturers can flexibly allocate those capacities in these supplier relations. To name one example, so CATL already has a factory in Germany, in the eastern part. In the next year, the Hungarian factory will open up, but we don't know how CATL's headquarters will allocate the production of different models of these battery cells between the German and the Hungarian assembly plants. So that is also part of the risks Petr mentioned with this growth model. We also have to add that battery cell manufacturing is the most profitable part and the largest part in the value chain. On this figure, I showed some Hungarian factories, Hungarian companies' financial records, and compared the profits before tax with the expenditure on wages. So here the large companies are always the battery cell manufacturers, which are large companies, and also large profits if we compare those with the expenditures on the wages. So these are the absolute numbers, so not per working hour or something like that, but it shows that some components manufacturers are like these medium-sized companies, but the larger ones will be and are the battery cell manufacturers. Petr already mentioned that part of the production regime is also to give state aid for the companies. In Hungary, it totaled 60 million euros in the past 5 years, and more is to come. And also approximately the same amount of public money is going into infrastructure development, particularly for these companies, which would include like industrial parks, infrastructure like new electricity grid for the factory, or water pipelines, or sewage systems, or roads or railroads, which are also built with the help of public money. And we also have to take these into account, and not only the direct state aid which the companies get. And also this is kind of a European model, I think so. And also because of this change after the COVID pandemic, that the EU is moving from this competitiveness kind of understanding into more of an active industrial policy with sectoral kind of decisions and these approvals. So this is not contrary to the European Union's trend, but largely kind of a version in the Eastern European region. Let me move to the last part, the labor regime. So there was this competition with the more flexible labor regime, which was typical for the past three decades. And this is continuing and going on with the battery manufacturing factories, for example, with this very intensification of work enabled by the lax labor law regulation, but also the company's decisions. To name one example, the wage structure is so that the net base wages do not reach the subsistence wage, but workers have to add shift supplements, overtime, need to be present and not losing attendance bonuses or production bonuses. And altogether, the wages are not that low, I would say, comparing to other parts of, for example, the domestic manufacturing jobs. But people need to work pretty hard for that, to earn those wages. And for example, if somebody is ill for one or 2 days, then he or she loses a large part of their salary in that month. So this is like kind of a flexible wage structure as well. We have seen that also in the IC manufacturing companies beforehand. So this is like an extension of that model. Also related to the labor regime and the regulations, there are recurring occupational health and safety issues at Hungarian cell manufacturers, suppliers, and recycling companies, to name a few. Lacking building permits of factories, fire cases, exposure to toxic materials like nickel and other, or cobalt or other materials, and even deadly work accidents. The issue is that occupational health and safety and labor inspection capacities are really weak in Hungary, but maybe also in other countries of the region. And the fines are really low. So what I did is to combine all of the fines the Samsung SDI's company in 2022 received from the labor inspection and occupational health and safety inspectors. And it was also, the fines they got was only 0.5% of the yearly profits. So these are not deterring them to, don't cope with the occupational health and safety issues and safe workplaces. So that's a recurring issue in most companies of the value chain, and also in terms of industrial relations, some union busting at some companies is also typical. A new thing in the Hungarian case, at least, is the labor migration from global South countries. So it was not that much present beforehand. It's a new phenomenon in the automotive value chain, but also in other sectors, which is driven particularly by this labor shortage environment. So the country is introducing selective labor market, labor migration regulation to bring in workers for mostly for unskilled jobs in the automotive sector, including the battery value chain. And there is also a substitution of Hungarian and Ukrainian workers with East Asian nationals in the past 1 or 2 years. And these East Asian workers are in a very precarious position. So they, for example, lose their residence and work permit if they quit their jobs. They get everything from the agency company, such as housing or the work contract. So it is like a very kind of almost like slave labor-like environment for these workers, which also leads to some local tensions also in the areas where these people are living, and especially because of the past years of really anti-immigration kind of discourses of the Hungarian government, and also locally in workplaces. So, for example, how to make alliances between core workers in these automotive firms and agency company workers coming from the Philippines. It is like really hard also for the unions. So my conclusion is that Hungary is a major player in the current EV transition in Europe, particularly in the battery value chain. And this transition strengthens a low-road growth model because of this production and labor regime in the global economic cycle. And one final note, if you are interested in further details, there is this shorter study I did last year, so very much is not anymore really actual because the changes are happening really rapidly, but most of the contextual information is there in this shorter study. So if you are interested in more, you can also take a look in that. And Petr also has like a very good studies already published. So if you're interested in the whole story, I think these might be also consulted. So that's from me, and I stop my screen sharing.
Thank you very much. It was very, very, very interesting. And I invite everyone to read the report Márton is talking about. He presented some parts of it at Czirfusz's last conference. And so we have 40 minutes of discussion, so you can ask your questions. I have some, and I know that many of you will also have different questions. And to break the ice, I have first questions for Márton. So first, you said that there was the creation of this BYD plant in Hungary, and so you talked about this double dependency of the Hungarian automotive industry, first towards East Asian technology firms, electronic technology firms, and on the other side, a dependency towards German firms. So the question is, could there be a third dependency towards this time Chinese firms? And why am I talking about this? It's because we're finishing this report with Tommaso for the ETUI on electrification in the French automotive industry. And one of the main results is that this electrification is partly driven by economic alliances with Chinese firms. This has begun, for example, with the participation of Dongfeng to the capital of PSA, but now more radically with the participation of Chinese firms to joint ventures of manufacturing batteries, of manufacturing electric powertrains, etc., etc. So this is an open question about the future of Chinese capital inside the European automotive industry. The second question is, I still, well, since there are literally no producing battery factories in France, I mean, operating battery factories in France today, so we cannot visit any of these plants. So the question I have is, well, I have two contradicting discourses on work organization inside battery assembly plants. The first one says that it's a very labor-intensive activity. And the other one says that it's a very capital-intensive activity, a very automated assembly lines, so possibility of reskilling, things like that. So I wanted to know more specifically, what do you think about this? Because I have the impression you tend towards more the de-skilling and the labor-intensive activity. And lastly, can you return more specifically to this profile of the battery industry workers? Because you mentioned these Filipino workers that come with almost like indenture contracts. But how many of these battery workers are immigrant workers? Why? Because again, in France, we have a very particular configuration where trade unions negotiate and sign collective agreements for the transfer of workers from internal combustion engine manufacturing plants belonging to Renault, belonging to PSA or Stellantis. And they are transferred to, for example, ACC plants or joint ventures of manufacturing of electric powertrain. So are there cases of this transfer of Hungarian workers from the OEMs towards these new factories or not? And so who are these battery workers? And I have one question for Peter Pavlinek. There is this workshop next week at the ETUI called more or less, can the European automotive industry be saved? Can the automotive industry still be saved? And I have the impression you say that the question is not whether it has to be saved or not, because as you said, there has been only 16,000 jobs lost since I think it was early 2000s. So if employment is not the stake today, what is it? And I have a hypothesis regarding this. Is it the quality precisely of employment that is really what's at stake today? Because as the ETUI says, one of the stakes is just transition for workers, and it's something that trade unions defend. Those are my questions. I saw that Mark has also some questions. I don't know, Mark, if you want to ask them out loud or if you want to just ask them in a written form. Anyway, that's it.
Well, I mean, the first question was about Petr when he says there was no battery cell manufacturing in Czech Republic, and he says that he could explain us why it was the case. So I would like to know his answer about this situation. And the second one is for Márton. And the BYD, as you know, is a very verticalized company in the battery value chain. And my question is, do they plan to install some battery value chain in operation in Hungary for components, processing, and so on? Or do they plan to import all these components from China?
Do you want to answer now, or do we have another question later?
We can also have like Bruno's, and then.
Okay, go ahead, Bruno, please.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. My question was, what do you think about the role of the Northern African countries in the next few years or in the future? Because as the integrated periphery in Eastern Europe has been displacing the integrated periphery of Spain and Portugal in the past, but nowadays there are not so many investments, I think, in Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. But maybe in the next few years, with lower labor costs and lower costs, maybe it could be also a focus of investments, and it could be displaced on this region that we have been analyzing today. What do you think is going to happen in the next few years?
Please go ahead.
Okay, I can start. All right. So one question was whether there are no gigafactories in Czechia. That's a good question. Now, maybe you know that Volkswagen planned to build one of its gigafactories in Eastern Europe, and it was supposed to be located in Czechia. Skoda really pushed strongly Volkswagen to basically announce this investment. Volkswagen's been negotiated with the Czech government for about 2 years. The location was selected. It was close to Pilsen in western part of the country, in western Bohemia. But at the end, last fall, Volkswagen announced indefinite, basically postponement of its decision. I think they have realized that they would have sufficient capacity with gigafactories that they have already kind of commissioned and decided about their construction in Germany and also in Spain. So there was definitely a goal to check plans. And as for now, there is no substitution for this planned Volkswagen investment. But there are other issues. I have talked to some people at the Ministry of Industry, and actually I have an interview on Monday with someone from the kind of investment agency. So one of the reasons is that basically Czechia has no construction sites for large investors ready or available for large factories. So the one that was supposed to accommodate Volkswagen was a former airport, military airport, and the military was against the plan. So when Volkswagen said we are not going to build it right now, the Ministry of Defense said, okay, so we are not allowing anyone else to go there. Another problem is, I was told that it takes about 2 years to get construction permits for investors in Czechia, that it's very complicated and complex. And I was told, because I asked, well, look at Hungary, and they said, well, the Hungarians streamlined the process of approving these construction permits and decisions. So it goes very fast, and foreign investors appreciate it. And the last factor I'd like to mention, it's more or less my speculation. The Czech government has been extremely hostile to China. Geopolitically, they support Taiwan, they criticize the Chinese. And they have state visits to Taiwan. Basically, they are provoking China, right? The Chinese government, the mainland China. And I think it is highly counterproductive. Many of these Chinese companies, these battery producers, there's a close relationship between the government and these factories. And I think that it might play a role. I mean, why would you build a factory in a country that is ready to confiscate foreign private property? The Czechs have been really quick to confiscate Russian assets and everything. Why would you do that? If you can invest in a country that is more friendly, not as aggressive, and it is less risky. And of course, foreign investors are very, averse to increased risks. So I think it's also part of the equation on the Chinese part, whether the Czechs want to admit it or not. You might have a different opinion about this. Okay. The second question was whether the European automotive industry can be saved. Well, now the questions, the production can be saved. It's about who will control the auto industry. Whether the auto industry will be controlled by European transnational corporations, whether it will be controlled by the Germans and the French and maybe the Italians, the traditional core of the core countries of the European automotive industry, or whether it will be controlled by the Chinese. Now, if the industry is controlled by the Chinese, then Europe will basically be facing Western Europe will be facing similar problems Eastern Europeans have been facing since the 1990s. I mean, all corporate decisions about the industry are made abroad in the context of their global operations. And of course, with foreign control, you have outflow of profits, so you have kind of less economic or smaller economic benefits. You have lower control over the industry as well, workers' rights, and so on. So I think it's not whether the industry can be saved as long as the European Union has the local content requirements. Cars will be made in Europe, but the question is by whom? That's what I think. And the last question for me was about the role of North African countries in the future. Well, I think this role will only increase because it's a new frontier for the European automakers in their basically drive for profit, which of course is their driving force behind the investment decisions. As you know, Morocco planned to, I think, make 2 million cars by 2025. It's all based on the association agreements with the European Union, giving access to the European market. So these factories are export-oriented mostly, or at least so far. So as long as they have access to the European markets, and also, of course, the local market might grow significantly. So there's untapped demand in North Africa that would support further production. And of course, labor costs are even lower than, let's say, in Romania. So Renault has been, of course, blackmailing workers in Romania, saying, well, if you do not accept our, wage proposals for maybe freezing wages or lower increase than inflation, then we will relocate the production to Morocco. And they built already a factory in Morocco. So I think the role of North African countries will increase. And it all makes sense and can, conceptually and theoretically be explained, because we saw, this kind of a shift in periphery, as you mentioned. It started with Belgium, and then the Iberian Peninsula, and then Eastern Europe. And as capital exhausts labor force that is available, labor surplus, wages increase. And then some investors start looking for new opportunities, new sites with lower cost labor and labor surplus. So basically, North Africa is perhaps the next frontier. But yeah, we'll see what's going to happen. I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you for the very important questions. I think I will start with a short one by Mark, whether BYD will produce batteries in Hungary or not. My latest information is that the EV plant will have batteries imported from China. So the cells or even the modules or packs, I don't know that concretely, but they will come from China. Although there were also some news in the lately that there will be like a module or pack assembly plant or a warehouse in the Budapest agglomeration that was also shown in one of the tables of Petr. So it's quite unclear yet, but they said that they won't build up a cell factory in Hungary. So that was one. There was a question in the chat about German-Hungarian trade union relationships. I can give you a few examples. So, for example, IG Metall and the Hungarian Metalworkers Federation, Vasas, they have quite a lot of joint work in advocating for better wages, better working conditions, and this transnational union solidarity, which was quite successful in some cases. For example, Mercedes, or also tier one companies like the former Continental, currently Vitesco plant. That's also one example. So they have these really strong collaborations there. What changes a bit with the battery, how I see, and that's, as far as I know, it's not only happening in Hungary, but also elsewhere, that trade unions in the automotive industry compete with trade unions in the chemical industry. What is actually a battery? It is like a chemical industry, product, and then it is the jurisdiction of the chemical industry union who has the chemical industry knowledge, because it is basically about chemicals. Or the other kind of argument, this is a component of an EV, of a car, and that's why the automotive industry unions will have to move in. So that's kind of also an issue in Hungary. And so one cell factory is already unionized, but they cannot collectively bargain because of the low membership rate yet. But these are from the chemical industry. So whether they can influence somehow the working conditions in the whole value chain, it won't be that easy, because at the other part of the value chain, the other trade union is there. So that makes the story a bit more complicated, at least in the Hungarian context. But there were also some discussions, I think, in the past 15-20 years, that it is also in the interest of the core country OEM workers in Germany to have better working conditions in Hungary, because then the two locations will not compete with each other. So that's sort of a trade union situation, which also leads to one of the questions of Sebastian about the profile of workers and whether there are collective agreements to this just transition. And the short answer is no. And that's also because of the low union density in that sense. So there are no cases like that. The immigrant workers in the cell manufacturing companies, this is very diverse, I would say, and we don't have that much information on that either. So my colleagues at Periféria did some interviews with workers. Sometimes they know about that roughly, or they have these knowledge from the assembly line, who are my colleagues and where they are coming from. And what we could get, and some sparse information from the media also. But for example, at the Samsung SDI factory, we don't even know how many workers are there in total. But there were some hints that at a certain point, half of the workers were agency workers, the other half were direct workers. But among the agency workers, there are also Hungarians, and not exclusively immigrant workers. But the tendency is that these immigrant workers from global South countries, they are brought in by the agency companies. And of course, there are no statistics how many of the agency company workforce works at which factory, and it changes like really rapidly also. So there might be that these contracts are changing, and in 1 week the one of the agency workers from the Philippines works at one company, and then if these contracts run out or there are these certain fluctuations in the production, then it might be that they will show up in another sector. So there is an increasing number, that's for sure, and we can say at least on the assembly line. So that concerns the unskilled workers on the assembly line. And also there is another group of migrant workers which are in the like engineers or in the offices where the South Korean companies bring their own managers from South Korea, or technicians or other skilled staff. So that's also present. And how it will, for example, the CATL factory next year, that will be interesting to see how it, whether there will be, for example, workers from China showing up on the assembly line. We don't know information about that yet, so we will see in the next years. And also maybe a footnote, the construction industry workers, these are also very interesting. So where they are coming from and which of the companies are building these factories, whether they are large Hungarian domestic construction companies, or which is in the case in some of the cell factories, whereas, for example, BMW contracted a Turkish construction factory for a large chunk of the factory build, and they brought in workers from China, which is like not migrant workers, but they are like more within this posting scheme, most possibly. So that's it. There was also a question by Sebastian about the Chinese companies and the economic alliances. Yeah, that's a complicated story. So my short answer always is that German OEMs and French OEMs need these East Asian companies for the next years and need the production sites in East Central Europe where the batteries can be produced cheaply. Because if we want to have cheap EVs for the European Union's population, for that we need cheap batteries, and cheap batteries can be more easily produced in Eastern Europe as elsewhere. I would say because of the labor cost, Petr also mentioned. So that's a short answer. The longer answer is that that might be also part of the risks East Central Europe as a location. So if the larger political climate changes and these restrictions will come up in the next years against Chinese companies, or the European industry is lobbying for putting Chinese companies out from the European Union, then the Hungarian way will be quite risky with a lot of Chinese companies. So we will see. I think very much will depend on also what is happening with the European elections in June. So how strong the new commission will be, what industrial strategy will take shape, how the lobbying force of the European automotives will change, and how quickly they can ramp up production with the European companies like Northvolt or the ACC or the other joint ventures, and whether they will be enough for the transition to the EVs and the production which will be needed for selling cars within the region. And the last one about the work organization of labor-intense and capital-intensive production. Yeah, that's a tricky question, and I don't have a definite answer to that. So for example, the Hungarian government always advertises these factories as high-tech kind of factories, which is true in the sense that high-tech assembly lines are coming into the country, but it doesn't mean that for that you need high-tech workers or high-tech workers. So certainly you need engineers to program these assembly lines. But as far as my understanding was, still there is a large part of the production process which is like unskilled work, which can be learned quite quickly. And also you need a lot of workers. So these gigafactories have like even CATL will have like 9,000 workers. So that's and that's also changing, I think. So there were some news lately in the Hungarian media that perhaps CATL with the full capacity won't need that much workers that it was originally intended. And this is also because I think the technology is changing and the assembly lines are changing. And if you plan to, if they announced the investment a few years back, and until the completion of the whole project, there might be new technologies moving in for which you won't need that much workers at the assembly lines, or even the battery technologies are also changing. But that's an interesting thing, I think, to track down more in detail. Unfortunately, some of these battery gigafactories are not yet operational, so there are not yet that much research on that, and it is, yeah, or we have to ask, I think, the industry experts on that. Maybe they tell us more about that, what is happening there. I think I went through all of that. So.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for these very comprehensive answers. I don't know if anyone else has questions. We still have time for one last round of questions. Peter,
Michal had one, but I don't have an answer for that. That's in the chat about EV production. Maybe Petr can answer that.
Please, Peter.
Okay. I wanted to ask a quick question, Márton, about BID in Szeged, because it's an interesting location choice. It's basically a peripheral region within Hungary, and also it is close to the border with Serbia. So my question is, to what extent this was driven by labor surplus availability in that region and a potential to tap into Serbia for workers to work in the factory. So traditional factors are no longer as important as access to labor at a particular cost. Is my impression correct, or is it completely wrong?
Yeah, I don't completely understand that location choice. So Szeged is one of the largest cities in Hungary, but less than 200,000 population. And what I heard from the economists at the University of Szeged, they said that there is a huge labor shortage already in the city, which has no manufacturing tradition in the really. So it is like only a few companies in manufacturing. So they don't expect that there will be too many people to work in an assembly company. The region is also in a demographic decline, and also most of the people left from the larger region towards other parts of the country previously. Szeged has a large university, but it is like more biotech focused, and biotech companies and some shared service centers are there who are employing people from the who are leaving the university, but that's a completely different sector as well. Romania is not very far either, but the wages on that part of Romania are slightly higher, I think, already than in near Szeged. So that is not a factor either. So, for example, from Timișoara or Arad, which are in the region, they would commute through the border. And commuting through the Serbian-Hungarian border is very complicated currently. So there are these long queues at the border control. So I don't think that that would be possible to bring people for the shifts there. And also the longer demographic trend there is that many of the people from that part of Serbia, Vojvodina, they left during the 1990s when during the Balkans War. There are also ethnic Hungarians, but they are already left, and to a large part, and also in the past 10 years, there were some regulations in Hungary that people from Serbia could get fast-track work permits to work in Hungary. And that was also kind of a labor inflow already before the COVID crisis. So I don't think that there are too many workers available there who would either move to Hungary or to the southern part, or to commuting is, I would say, that's out of the question. So that will be an interesting story to see. I would suppose migrant workers from third countries will be needed. But I will, yeah, I have serious doubts where workers will come from.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one question by Marc Calochet in the chat.
Yeah, just another question which is related to your previous answer. So you say that BYD is not going to localize battery value chain, but European regulation are going to push for battery value chain localization. That's going to start in 2027. So my question is how BYD is going to achieve these requirements?
I have no answer for that. Sorry. Yeah, maybe I don't know whether there are certain tricks to circumvent these kind of regulation, like do the final putting cells into modules or packs at a Hungarian location or within the EU, whether it would be possible to circumvent these regulations. I'm not that much familiar with that.
But yeah, but the next regulation are going to push for production component and processing of raw materials. So really it's a very core component of the battery. It's not only a question of final assembly. So it's an open question. But when you add this question to the previous one related to the ability to have some workers in this area of Hungary, so what do you think? Is it really a good, do you think they will have a very efficient production in this location or not?
In terms of availability of the workers, or?
I mean, there is this question of battery value chain localization with the issue of workers. That was your last response to a previous answer. So all in all, do you think they will have a very efficient EVs production facility?
That's I think a good question. So if the if the factory would work with agency workers who are coming from third countries, from the global south countries, without their families, who have work permits for 2 years, for example, 3 years, they want to earn more during those years, which means that the production could still be quite efficient with these very indentured immigrant workers. So that might help the company find workers and to have an efficient kind of production within Hungary. And also, at the current point, we don't know how much subsidy they will get from the Hungarian government, or what are the details of the deal. I think these will only be announced after the decision is made by the European Commission about the state aid and the other circumstances. So there might be, so you can compensate as a company somewhat with all of these investment incentives, this production kind of problems when they appear, and Hungary could still be the best option among other countries if you take this also into account, that, for example, the company is getting the factory location with all of this infrastructure, and then perhaps also some tax breaks regarding earnings or wages. So that might be also part of the deal. And until then, I think we can't really see how much or to which extent this factory will be effective. And thank you for the battery chain localization. We have to, I have to do more research on that and look at that in detail, whether they will be allowed to match these requirements.
Thank you very much for your answers. I don't know if there are Any more questions?
Or an answer to Miha's question, which was that
Yes.
whether anyone from the audience has data on EV production by country across time, because he knows that there are paid databases, but have not seen any comprehensive and free data where EVs are assembled across the world, across time, and not globally by brands.
It's a very good question to which I do not have myself also an answer.
You are muted.
Of course. No, thank you very much for your presentations. I believe it was extremely interesting, and we see that these are also events unfolding as we speak. Even some things that we will publish in the next few months perhaps will no longer be pertinent in the next few years, but it will contribute to also to have a more clearer vision of what could come or what could become the international automotive industry, the European automotive industry. And we can continue to discuss these subjects in Bordeaux next June. So you are also everyone invited to present a paper at our conference in Bordeaux. And there will be, of course, a very big space contributed to this kind of issues. We will have some keynote speakers that are to be confirmed, someone from the head of Renault and from Stellantis. We will also visit a factory of manufacturing electric vehicles, small electric vehicles in the region of Bordeaux. And voila, this is more or less the program that is still being put in place, but I invite you very strongly to present. Voila, that's it. And again, I'm sorry Tommaso couldn't come. He wrote to me during your presentations that he sadly couldn't come. So he excuses himself. Voila, voila.
Thank you.
Anyway, see you very soon.
See you.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Sébastien?
Oui.
Oui, donc en fait, je vais enregistrer le Zoom sur mon PC. Je t'envoie un lien après pour que tu le récupères.
Envoie-le directement à Tommaso, s'il te plaît, parce que lui, c'est lui qui le met en ligne.
D'accord.
Merci.
Ok, ça marche.
Super, merci beaucoup, merci. Parce
Ah
qu'en fait, mon ordi est trop vieux, il a plus d'espace.
Bon, ok. Mais en tout cas, j'espère que ça a marché. Allez, à bientôt.
Bon
Sébastien.
week-end, au revoir.
Merci, toi aussi, au revoir.